Can I welcome everybody to this afternoon's meeting? It's my pleasure for this meeting. I need to improve my classroom technique. It's my pleasure to introduce Victoria Brittain, who's going to be speaking to us for about 30 minutes or so, and after that we will take questions and contributions. There will be, because the room is quite full and it's quite difficult to see from here, and often quite difficult to balance discussion and debate, there will be speakers' slips going around from the people in the red team t-shirts. For those of you who haven't used it before, it's simply a matter of writing down your name, roughly the points you want to make or the question you want to ask, and it allows us to make sure that we do make an even debate, and we do try and include as many different points of view in the discussion as possible. So don't be shy to use the speaker slips. I want to just start by saying that Victoria, for those of you who haven't been lucky enough to hear her speak before, is a very well-known journalist and a campaigner who has fought for a very long time now to put right the wrongs of our rulers and to fight to defend people's civil liberties. She's also on the board of a magazine called Race and Class, and she's the co-author of a book that you can get in bookmarks, which is the book by Muazzin Beg, the excellent book, An Enemy Combatant. So I'll introduce Victoria now. We're going to have about 30 minutes of speech and then questions and contributions. If you think of something while she's speaking, please do fill in the speaker slip so we can discuss straight away.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay at the back? No. Start again then. Can you hear me now at the back? No? Can you still not hear me? Can you hear me now? Ah, okay. If my voice drops at the back, maybe you could just raise your hand, and I'll realize that I've stopped speaking clearly enough for you. Okay. Well, I'm extremely pleased to be here again at Marxism, but I'm very sad that I'm talking about the same subject as I was talking about last year, which is Guantanamo. And I sincerely hope that by next year I will be able to talk about something completely different. I think it's a tremendous failure of all of us in any kind of movements against the worst things that the Bush and Blair administrations are doing, that we've made so little impact on Guantanamo. In fact, since the first Muslim prisoners were shipped to Guantanamo Bay from Afghanistan in early 2002, it was fairly obvious that this aspect of the American so-called war on terror was probably going to be a very critical phase for the history of the 21st century. Now, not everybody saw that at the beginning, but some of us did, and I'm afraid we're more than right. And it's kind of ironic that that's so, because the whole point of Guantanamo Bay, the whole point of putting those people there, was that we wouldn't notice, that we wouldn't know about it. So they were supposed to be invisible and forgotten, and to some extent the fact that we haven't managed to get them out shows that they've been more successful than we have, they being the administration. At that point, I was thinking of three underlying themes, and I think they still remain the three things that you need to bear in mind when thinking about Guantanamo. Those are the question of international law, the question of United States exceptionalism, and thirdly, the question of Western relationships with the Muslim world, especially here in the UK because of our deep involvement with the Americans. So if you can hold those three things in the back of your minds when I'm talking about the more concrete things, that is the kind of framework that I like to think of this in. It was more than 3 years ago I started researching a play called Guantanamo on a Bound to Defend Freedom. And that play was about some of the Muslim families here in Britain who had sons or husbands in Guantanamo. And at that point, nobody really knew anything about them. And because the media here was full of headlines like the Tipton Talibans and things like that, needless to say, the families were extremely ill-disposed to talk to anybody from the press. But in the end, because I was working on a play, and the director of the play, Nick Kent, who runs the Tricycle Theatre in North London, had very good relations with their lawyers, he managed to arrange for us to interview them. And that was the kind of beginning of my beginning to understand this issue. And it's astonishing to me that what was conceived of as a very humble little play about half a dozen families living in different parts of Britain who had been hit by this earthquake of their children or their husbands being taken away, has actually turned into something that's been seen in dozens of countries and translated into lots of different languages, and has even been shown in America in lots of different theatres, but more importantly, in lots of community groups. And the kind of feedback that we've had from that play has been really incredible in the terms of how much it's raised people's consciousness. Now, there are two places where it hasn't raised any consciousness. It was read in the House of Commons in February of this year, and it was read in Congress in April of this year. And to the House of Commons reading, we had less MPs than I could count on this one hand. I mean, lots of other people came, but the MPs didn't come. And in Congress, we got 2 congressmen, and they didn't even stay for the whole thing, and it was a very short version of the play. So one of the things that I've kind of learnt over this period has been, and I think the play illustrates this very, very well, and in a way it's kind of what this whole Marxism thing is about, is the enormous gap between the political class and the rest of us. And I think the responsibilities upon us because of that are very, very great, and it gives me tremendous pleasure to see so many people much younger than my generation here, and I hope you take that responsibility extremely seriously. As I was saying, that the play, the fact that it's still being shown in various places astonishes me, because it's terribly out of date. There's now all but one of the men that we wrote about have been released. And there's been a steady drip, drip, drip of information about what actually happens in Guantanamo and who is actually in there, both from the people who've been released, and Elaine already referred to Moazem's very important book, Enemy Combatant. But also there have been lawyers who've been in there, and so there is a constant stream of information. If you want to know what's happening in Guantanamo, you can know, which at the time we wrote the play was simply not so. Nobody knew anything, nobody on the outside. So I've worked on the campaigns of the 9 Britons who've now been released, but I just want to highlight the fact that there are 8 British residents who have still not been released. And it's one of those campaigns that I really hope that people here will take up. We've worked very, very hard, but completely ineffectually on the question of these 8 British residents. I've also worked with quite a lot of the lawyers and the families of other prisoners, including some of the French prisoners, the Bosnians, the Algerians, and the Kuwaitis. Just people who've either contacted me or by chance, because I speak their language, we've kind of got to know each other. And one of the things I've learnt from all these families, and to me is the most important thing that comes out of Moazem's book, is the logic of the trajectory by which he ended up in Guantanamo and has ended up now as a kind of spokesman for the people still inside. And it's that logic of his trajectory which I think comes out really well in the book, and I'm sure many of you will be able to hear him. He's speaking here on Saturday. And again, it's another of these things which is about the gap between them, being the authorities, and the rest of us. The logic of what happened to him and the way he came to be in Afghanistan is kind of obvious to us when you read it and you listen to him. But it's something that the authorities neither in Bagram, nor in Kandahar, nor in Guantanamo, nor even back here, they simply cannot believe it. They're always asking the same questions. Well, why? And I think this very determined myopia of the Western authorities goes to the heart of why Guantanamo matters so much. I think it is the symbol. Well, I would have said the symbol until what's happened in Gaza. But along with what's happening in Gaza, it's the symbol of how Muslims are treated in a different way in this world because the Americans have decided to make them their enemies. And that is just the very fundamental thing that you can't get away from when you're thinking in any way about the war on terror, as they like to call it, or any of the linked things like the Western occupation of Iraq and the destruction of Iraq and what's going on in Afghanistan as well. Never mind the threats to Iran. All of these are manifestations of the Western perception of their entitlement to run the world. And I think it's that, our determination that that is not the way things are going to be, that brings us here together. So just to go back to Guantanamo now, I want to start by just mentioning a very important report that was done by an American law school called Seton Hall University, which came out in February of this year. And it was based on thousands of pages of documents released under the Freedom of Information Act. And it shows in the starkest possible terms what a completely blunt and useless instrument Guantanamo has been and still is. The analysis revealed that of the men in Guantanamo, only 5% were captured by the Americans. Only 8% were alleged to be linked to Al-Qaeda. 8%. 55% had committed no hostile act against the United States. And of the remaining 45%, the hostile act included fleeing from US bombing, which is what happened to Mosul. Now, I think those figures are enough to tell you what a completely mad project Guantanamo was. And later on, I'm sure somebody will ask me, well, why do you think they're doing it? And we'll come back to that. But first of all, I just want to give you the 7 central facts about Guantanamo and its remaining probably about 400 prisoners, although well over 1,000 have been passed through there. So these are the 7 facts. The deliberate use by the Bush administration of a place that was beyond the rule of law. Guantanamo was first used by the first George Bush to hold Haitian refugees, and then his people formulated the idea that the US Constitution did not apply there. Second is the randomness of the collection of these Muslim men. They vary between very young boys, very old men, some of them senile, and a lot of Afghan elderly peasants who have absolutely no idea what is going on and have never been interrogated. Some Chinese who've never been interrogated, and many, many prisoners from Pakistan and the Gulf who were actually sold to the Americans by their personal enemies, often through police chiefs and so on. The third point is the regular and systematic use of torture in interrogation and of sadistic brutality by the guards. Fourth is the repetition of interrogations, completely pointlessly, repetitions again and again and again, by both the American and other intelligence services, including the British. Fifth, and very important, is the decision to abrogate the Geneva Conventions. And sixth is the question of extraordinary rendition, which, if you don't use that fancy term, what it is actually is kidnapping Muslim men from a large variety of countries and taking them to other countries to have them tortured at the behest of the Americans before they then send them on to Guantanamo Bay. Luckily, there's begun to be a bit of a row about that, but I mean, we're only having the row now, and this has been going on for these last 4 years. And then the last point is, beyond Guantanamo, there are the so-called black sites. Now, there are probably at least 50 prisoners, maybe more, who are held in places which may be in Thailand, maybe in Diego Garcia, maybe in some parts of Afghanistan, held by the CIA. Nobody, including the Red Cross, has ever had any possibility of either knowing who they are or exactly where they're held. This is totally extraordinary in the 21st century. This is being done by the country which prides itself on being a democracy and holding up human rights standards for everybody else in the world. Just take it in, because one of the problems about Guantanamo is that it's become slightly banal in a way in our ideas. Everybody knows Guantanamo is terrible, but when you actually think about people being held in places where nobody knows where they're being held, what's being done to them, and how long they're going to be there, this is not the world that we want to live in. I'll just very briefly address some of those points. Last week you probably read there was a certain amount of hoo-ha about the latest round of Supreme Court hassling with the administration. And there was a 5-3 ruling that the military commissions in Guantanamo violated US and international law. Well, for the lawyers who were working on Guantanamo, this was a fantastic victory. But for the men in Guantanamo, this was another meaningless bit of juggling with the law. There are only 10 people who are supposed to be being tried on military commissions anyway, and none of them have been tried on these military commissions. And all they are is just another group of military officers making judgments about people without telling them what they're accused of. So don't be fooled that there was some wonderful strike for justice in that Supreme Court ruling of last week. 2 years ago, June 2004, there was the first Supreme Court ruling that we all really rejoiced about, which was that the Supreme Court said all the prisoners in Guantanamo had the right to be heard in federal courts. Phew, we all thought, they're going to get court hearings. And it's a very sad bit of Mozam's book when he writes about that. He finds out about it, he's totally elated, and then he finds out it's all meaningless. So for 2 years, since that Supreme Court ruling, not one single person has seen the inside of any court, never mind a court in the United States. So that's my first point on the law. On the question of the randomness of the people who've been taken, on the questions of torture and on the questions of interrogations, there's a mass of evidence about what has gone on. And if any of you are interested in this issue and feel you don't really know a lot about it, if you go to the website www.cageprisoners.com, that has a really fantastic and constantly updated reports, both from all the lawyers who work on Guantanamo, all the journalists who write about it, and sometimes, terribly, letters from people inside Guantanamo, and particularly over the period of the hunger strikes. Some of those letters were just really so unbelievably terrible to read. But I urge you to look at that, because as I said, one of the dangers, I think, of us knowing quite a lot about Guantanamo is that it's become just another terrible thing. It isn't just a terrible thing, it is the most terrible thing that we have to work to have it closed down. So I won't say more about the horrors of the torture and the things that have been done to people. One of the worst things about doing meetings with Mozam, which I often do, is that almost invariably somebody in the audience asks him, well, what's it really like to be tortured? Or even worse, they ask him, particularly if they're journalists, what was the sexual torture like? Or did you have sexual torture? And a lot of the men who suffered these things have written about it or have given interviews about it, and all of the horror is there on Cage Prisoners if you want to know about it. I want to briefly make a point about the Geneva Conventions. When the White House made the decision, the White House lawyers, and I remind you that the main White House lawyer who drew up the gradations of torture and drew up the idea that the Geneva Conventions were some quaint old-fashioned thing that you needn't really bother about in the new world since 9/11, is now the United States Attorney General, Alberto Gonzales. Remember him. At some point, he'll get his comeuppance. I don't quite know how we'll do it, but it'll happen. And there's a whole string of other lawyers who've worked in the White House. And their main contribution to American civilization has been to normalize torture and, as I said, to try to successfully bypass the Geneva Conventions. That when you decide to not bother about the Geneva Conventions, you're wiping out half a century of civilization. The Geneva Conventions were drawn up after World War II precisely to make sure that things like Guantanamo never happened. I won't say more on rendition either because we haven't got a lot of time, but there are a lot of very, very terrible stories about people who've been kidnapped, and not only from Pakistan and other places. They've been kidnapped in Europe, one in Milan, two in Sweden, and one in Macedonia. And certainly in the cases of the first two, the Western European ones, there's no doubt that the intelligence services of those countries knew exactly what was going to happen to those people. And this is another mark of how the normalization of this kind of grotesque and inhuman behavior has crept over Europe. I just want to quote from one person, Major Dan Murray, who was the former head prosecutor of the Marines, and he's now the defense counsel for the Australian prisoner. There's just one Australian prisoner, where he's also trying to get British nationality, David Hicks. And we interviewed Dan Murray for the play, and he said this, and I think it really encapsulates something which he says it very, very wonderfully. And if you imagine him as a 6'6" Marine with that kind of haircut, he's a young fellow in his sort of early 30s, I would say, and this is what he said. The United States court-martial system is an efficient and fair criminal justice system, which has jurisdiction to try law of war violations. But all of a sudden, you see this step back to before the Geneva Conventions apply, doing away with all the safeguards and checks and balances in the justice system that are there to ensure that innocent people aren't convicted. The system can't be controlled by people with a vested interest only in convictions. So we have a lot of very unexpected allies. I just want to finish by saying that Guantanamo, as I said at the beginning, is just one strand of the war on terror. And its impact on Arabs and on Muslims everywhere is very, very clear to everyone in the Middle East and beyond. And it's very extraordinary that in this country and in the United States, apart from in the Muslim communities, people don't seem to understand that. And again, to reiterate all its aspects, the US occupation of Iraq, what the Israelis are doing in the occupation of the West Bank, and now the collective punishment and killings in Gaza, the torture by the Americans in Abu Ghraib and in Bagram and Guantanamo. With all these things, the war on terror is creating more people who are called by some people resistance fighters, by others terrorists, happening every day. And it's shameful that our Prime Minister here can deny that this is happening. It's part of so many, many people's experience across the world. And as their sons and their husbands and their neighbours, give their resources and even their lives to resist the war on terror. We have to work very hard here to change the trajectory of the way our government wants to see things and its slavish copying of America in these things. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Victoria. We have plenty of time for questions and contributions. I'm going to call people to come up. I'm afraid there's only a microphone here to use in pairs. If you want to put a slip in, you can get a slip now from the people in red shirts. The first person I'm going to call is Eugene Grant. And while he's getting ready to come up and speak, could Arthur Johnston indicate whether you want me to read your question out or if you want to come up to the microphone to ask it? Eugene. Arthur Johnston, can you just wave at me if you want to come to the microphone? Otherwise, I'll read your question out.
It's around here.
You want me to read yours? Oh, yes, you can read your Eugene. Okay. I'm not going to read all your contributions, everybody, but sorry, I'm confused. Are you Eugene?
Yes,
right. Okay, Eugene, I'll read your contribution. In the last year, the USA dismissed a United Nations report on Guantanamo and changed its torture laws to allow practices like sensory deprivation, punishable under UK and international law. How has the UK been allowed to do this? Regarding international law, have there been any repercussions led by the United Nations? Okay, is Arthur ready to speak? Yeah. And after Arthur, if Virginia Rodino could be ready to come to the microphone and make her contribution. What have you done with it there?
I'm going to reply to everybody at the end.
Hi, my question is, what are the ages of the people that are currently being held at Guantanamo Bay?
I should explain, sorry, Victoria will take actually all the questions at the end of the discussion.
So the most recent thing that happened in Guantanamo has been the 3 suicides in Guantanamo Bay. And what that has led to is a shutdown of the media. Bush has not allowed any of the media to report on that. And the 3 journalists who were over there protested that. And that has actually forced Bush to publicly say that he wanted to close down Guantanamo. Though we of course know that he won't do that willingly. But I think that the United States anti-war movement has actually done a lot of work to put pressure on the administration to reveal all the problems with Guantanamo. So I just wanted to give a little bit of a rundown on some of the work that we've been doing there. The Cuban government had actually allowed a pilgrimage of U.S. activists to go up to the gates of the prison. And this wasn't covered by the media, but about 25 activists had a 3-day fast there, and the prisoners did hear about that. And I think that gave them, a little bit more confidence to keep up the struggle. There's another play on Guantanamo that did the circuit in the United States, and that helped generate a lot of publicity as well. On the April 29th demonstration in New York City, we actually had an anti-torture contingent where they dressed in orange jumpsuits and had a rolling cage that did the length of the march, which also raised the consciousness of people. There's a frequent vigil in front of the White House, again, where folks dress up in orange jumpsuits and replicate the torture that goes on in Guantanamo. I think this has led to some other really important events that have happened. For example, the military legal teams on both sides that have been assigned to both prosecute and defend the prisoners in Guantanamo have officially protested the U.S. government's lack of justice in the trials. So again, military lawyers that have been assigned to prosecute the prisoners have formally protested the fact about the injustice. And then lastly, I think that torture and this illegal detainment of prisoners is a manifestation product of war and imperialism in general. So that we even see in Canada that they have their own Guantanamo Bay, where they have held 5 Muslim men without trial now for over 4 years. And this is in Canada. So So I think there's a little bit more optimism than you had allowed, because the U.S. anti-war movement does have Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib and prison and torture high on the list of things that they fight against. So if you can just comment on some of that, that would be great. Thanks.
The next person to speak will be Azeldin El Sharaf, who will be followed by Christine Bird.
Hi, everybody. Actually, because of the suffer that reach Muslim and Arab world, I'd like to say that even Libyan people, they've got it. Now the relationship between Gaddafi, the dictator, for 37 years, and he was the first terror person on the American and the Western list, and now he become the closest person and who is the most important for America, maybe Bush and Blair. And he is now the very close helper in war on terror. Libyan people suffered of that, and a lot of Libyan politic people and who tried to get rid of Gaddafi by force, they've been put in list as terror and linked to the Islamic terrorists, and they've been in Guantanamo as well. So we've got Omar Grace. He is from Britain here, but he is Libyan originally, and his father, I think maybe somebody knows that his father killed by Gaddafi's torture in prison. The other thing is, in relation of that, the police raid on Libyan community, because of the agreement between Gaddafi and Bush to get rid of Libyan position who tried to get rid of Gaddafi by force or to help people in Libya by money or whatever. So now, as Libyan person, I'm here in Britain. I don't feel safe because of this relation. So what I'm asking, I'm just want to debate and to say I will work with the movement, and I will do my best.
Christine will be followed by Charlie Winstanley.
I was just thinking about, some of the reasons why Guantanamo has happened, because it is symbolic. It's a massive symbol across the world of, the injustice of what America and Britain are doing. But I don't think it's exceptional. It hasn't come out from nowhere. You can look at our societies in Britain and America, and you can see where it's come from. If you think about injustices, for a start, that's a big injustice in Guantanamo. Well, we have injustices all the time in Britain. I don't think that a single police officer has ever been prosecuted for any deaths of the people in police custody. Christopher Alday, the black man from Yorkshire, springs to mind, or Jean-Charles de Menezes. I mean, how public was that? And nobody's been prosecuted, so that's not new. I think that I was reading a bit about Guantanamo, and also it strikes me that it reflects neoliberalism in our society. Like, for just one example, is there are targets on information, right? So it's not quality of information, it's how much information you can get, which therefore is a good reason why they use so much torture, because when you torture people, you can get a hell of a lot more information, and people are rewarded on that basis. Torture is routine in American prisons. I think that the people who were on trial for the torture at Abu Ghraib, they were ex-prison officers. That's what they were. That's where they'd learned the trade. That's already been developed in American prisons. And finally, I think that the racism that's at the heart of it, we've got that in our society anyway. But you can see it in Guantanamo, where people had to have the beards shaved, or the Quran was defiled, you know, against a religion, or even just the basic fact of not being able to speak to somebody in your own language, you know, being separated. You're not allowed to be held with people in your own language group, which is really, that's mental torture. But then it does remind me a bit, my friend's mum is in hospital at the moment. She's an Asian woman, and they didn't provide an interpreter for her. She didn't understand what was going on. So, you know, this is happening in our society. Anyway, so basically I feel that it's a symbol of is this freedom, US style. This is what we're fighting for, freedom and democracy. You know, it's just massive injustice, and shows what American and British imperialism are all about. But I think that at the end of the day, it's not exceptional. And what's also not exceptional, it's a threat to us all. If they can do this to one group of people, they can do it to the rest of us. And that's why it has to be central, and we do need to resist.
While Charlie's coming up, I've got a question from David Horton, who's asked, I have heard that torture in Guantanamo is used to extract false confessions. What do you think about that theory? After Charlie, if Nick Richmond could be ready to come to the microphone, because I have got quite a few slips now.
Right. Yeah, just more of a comment and a kind of observation than a question or anything. Basically, I think that what Guantanamo shows is how inextricably linked you've got the anti-war movement is to the civil rights movement. I mean, what we've seen all around the globe is in the global fight against terror. We've seen invasions on countries, followed by, you know, quick right hook round the jaw on civil liberties as well. And that's the justification for the civil liberties argument. And to me, I think that this actually creates a lot of opportunities, a lot of potential for the Stop the War movement in itself. If we can manage to link these arguments together to the wider public, because I know for a fact that there's lots of people who are as scared about the loss of civil liberties and who are as disgusted by the atrocities committed in Guantanamo by American soldiers as anybody in the anti-war movement, yet still don't quite link the two together and see. And I've done some campaigning on the ground up in Preston in Lancashire, and I will say that some of those civil liberties petitions and things that we got there, they're the easiest petitions that you'll ever have to get anyone to sign. And I was just saying, on a sort of practical note, that I think there's a lot of potential for us to try and link those two arguments together to show people that actually, you know, the war on terror, the invasion of Iraq, it's all linked to the loss of civil liberties. And yeah, so, thanks.
Nick will be followed by Innocent and Kung. Nick? Oh, that was Nick, I'm sorry. Innocent will be followed by Matt Rainey.
Thank you. I'm Innocent from the Congo. I'm a French speaker. Sorry for my English will not be very, very good because I'm a French speaker. I asked two questions really. What are... Yeah, I asked two questions. The first one was, what are the causes of terrorism? And the second one, what about USA, UK, and other superpower terrorism in Africa? Western powers are really abusing the rights of poor people. And when people want their rights to be recognized, and if world powers are not responding to their questions, so they react in return. And some of the people are just using terrorism, are killing people. But if we would like to find answers of terrorism, I would like to ask who is terrorist and who is not. Because Tony Blair, George Bush, and others are just going against terrorism, but they are the first people who are terrorizing this world. And Africa, and particularly the Congo, is terrorized by Western powers, by George Bush and Tony Blair. I would like just to take the case of the Congo, because Congo is a rich country in Africa, and Congo has a lot of minerals. There is war in the Congo since '96, and behind this war is the exploitation of natural resources in the Congo. We can't have laptops, computers, mobile phones without a product called coltan. And in today's world, coltan is found in the Congo and in Australia. And since they have found that they can take coltan from the eastern part of the Congo, so they have created a false war in the Congo. And there is an invasion in the Congo from countries like Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi. So Western powers are selling arms to rebels and dictators in the Congo. They are supporting rebels and dictators in the Congo. And while people are killing each other, there are Western companies, more than 15 foreign companies, illegally exploiting Congolese mineral resources. And they are getting these resources out of the Congo via Rwanda, Uganda, Burundi, South Africa, and so on. But Congolese people are suffering, and they are very poor. So students don't go to school because their parents can't afford to send them to school. This is a terrorism. This is terrorizing people. And people are coming here to seek asylum. I think they would not like to seek asylum in Britain, in USA, or in any other country in Europe or in America. But if people are coming here to seek asylum, it's because their rights are abused in their countries of origin. So if Western powers stopped exploiting Congolese mineral resources, African mineral resources, and let democracy going on there, I think we will stop what we are saying, the war on terror. So I would like us in this meeting to exploit the causes of terrorism and to find ways how we can end this. Thank you.
Matt will be followed by Kashif from the Racial Equality Council. Could Kashif be ready to speak? Because there actually are quite a lot of slips now, and could people not speak for more than 3 minutes each?
I just wanted to say something about why Guantanamo is happening as well, because George Bush always says it's a war about terror, and I think it's not a war on terror, it's a war of terror, and it's a war of persecution of people around the world. Because they said about, going back to 2003 and about the war in Iraq, we're told it's about human rights, about bringing democracy. You don't need mass prison camps, you don't need hundreds of people to be held in Guantanamo Bay, hundreds of people to be held in Abu Ghraib, thousands across Iraq being held prisoner, in Gaza, in Kabul as well, if it's a war of liberation. And I think that's what is at the heart of it. It's a heart, Guantanamo is a symbol because it symbolises the imperialist conquest of the Middle East by the British and Americans. And I think some of the racism that we're seeing in Guantanamo Bay, and also here with increasing Islamophobia as well, I think when you look back at British history, it was Britain who basically invented concentration camps in the Boer War in South Africa in the early 1900s. So there's been a long history of both Britain and America using concentration camps. When you think about what the racism they're having to spin out, the US Constitution says that everybody is born free and equal. So how is it that some people can be born free and equal and other people can't be born free and equal and be held in Guantanamo Bay? And I think that is where the racism comes from, because they have to be able to demonise one group of people and say somehow those Muslims in Iraq, somehow those Muslim people around the world are inferior to everybody else, to justify saying we've got equal human rights at home, but they're not allowed for other people in the world. Just in the same way as the British Empire said, everybody at home has got freedom and free rights, but the slaves are somehow different, they're somehow inferior. And the racism that came out of that in the British Empire, when that was at its height, we're now seeing the same racism with the American Empire, which is now at its height. And I think that's why Islamophobia is coming about. And I think what Guantanamo represents to me is the imperialism and the conquest of the Middle East, and the fact that in order to manage to occupy other countries and to hold down the majority of the people around the world, they have to resort to torture and getting rid of human rights to do so.
Hello there.
While Kashif is speaking, could Jeremy Gunn just indicate whether you want me to read out your question or come to the microphone? But read it out, okay. And Kashif will be followed by Richard Boyd Barrett.
Okay, guys. Good afternoon. My name is Kashif. I'm a Muslim, and I have a copy of the Quran in my hand. And this is a document brought by Muhammad, peace be upon him, and it talks about torture in hellfire. Now, the torture that USA put on the Muslims in this world is nothing. It's a drop. It's a mosquito's wing compared to the torture God will enforce on them. Now, if we don't listen to the person who is guiding, then we're ignoring the truth. Now, I'll just read something from the Quran, chapter 81. It's just a little a chapter talking about the folding up. When when the sun with its spacious light is folded up, when the stars fall, losing their luster, when the mountains vanish like a mirage, when the she-camels 10 months with young are left unattended, when the wild beasts are herded together in the human habitations, when the oceans boil over with a swell, when the souls are sorted out being joined like with like, when the female infant buried alive is questioned for what crime she was killed, when the scrolls are laid open, when the sky is unveiled, when the blazing fire is kindled to fierce heat, and when the garden is brought near, then shall each soul know what it hath put forward. So surely I call to witness the planets that recede, go straight or hide, and the night as it dissipates, and the dawn as it breathes away the darkness. Surely this is the word of a most honorable messenger, endued with power, held in honor by the Lord of the throne, with authority there and faithful to his trust. And O people, your companion is not one possessed, and without doubt he saw him in clear horizon, neither does he withhold grudgingly a knowledge of the unseen, nor is the word of Satan accursed. Then where do you wander? Surely there is no less than a message to all the worlds, will with benefit to whoever among you wills to go straight, but you shall not will except as Allah wills. Allah mean one God, the cherisher of the worlds.
Okay, just before Richard speaks, Jeremy's question was who, if anyone, should put on trial the detainees and decide their sentences. Richard will be followed by Selina Whitby.
Yeah, I just want to really endorse what Victoria said about the huge significance and huge importance of us mobilizing around this issue, because as she said, I think what we need to understand is that the war on terror, as well as being a war about oil, resources, and, if you like, global dominance, is critically and centrally a war about normalizing the notion that some people can be killed, tortured, kidnapped, and treated as less than human. That is the agenda that these people are operating. They want to undo, what they used to call, they don't talk about it much anymore, but they want to undo what they used to call the Vietnam syndrome, where it was okay to kill millions of gooks, basically, as they framed it. The people who are pushing the Bush administration in the direction of what they've done in Iraq, in the direction of Guantanamo Bay, in the direction of suspending human rights and opting out of the Geneva Convention, that's what they want to do. They want to normalize the idea that you can just go in and bomb people, and the killing of tens of thousands of some people, particularly Muslims, is somehow less important, less significant, less horrendous than for example, one Israeli officer who is captured by Palestinians trying to defend themselves against the onslaught of the Israeli state. That is the agenda. It's the agenda. It's the agenda that was spelt out boldly and brazenly at the beginning of the occupation of Iraq, when they said, we don't do body counts. We count our dead. We're not concerned about their dead. And you can also talk about, as well as Guantanamo itself, let's not forget what's going on in Abu Ghraib and across Iraq. There are tens of thousands of people suffering the same conditions that were being described in Guantanamo Bay. No trial, no charges, just suffering in appalling conditions. And even though there's been talk of the act being cleaned up a little bit in Abu Ghraib, it's worth saying there's a guy we have, and I just mentioned it to Chris Nynan from Stop the War. You should try and get him over here. But we have a guy who's a former interrogator in Abu Ghraib doing a tour for us in Ireland in the next few weeks, who's become a conscientious objector. And what he says is that now what is going on is that the torture is being done out in the field. That people who are captured don't arrive into the prisons. Now there's a little bit more oversight. In some of the prisons, the torture is being done out in the field by the troops. People don't get brought to the prisons till 3 or 4 days after they've actually been captured. Right? So this stuff is still going on, and it's being pushed. From the top. But really, the one point I want to make is that I agree with Victoria completely that it is very depressing that this stuff is still going on, and that it is a very, very serious agenda. However, I'm a little bit hopeful that the tide is beginning to shift on the issue, and partly at least because of what's going on among US troops. I mean, I think the fact that an interrogator for the US military in Abu Ghraib is coming out, as are thousands of American soldiers, and blowing the whistle on what's going on is actually beginning to turn the tide in the US itself. In Ireland recently, there's been a huge debate and so on in Ireland about our involvement in the rendition programs. And 55 of the CIA flights went through our airports, but the Irish government said that they had sought clear assurances from the USA that there were no prisoners on these. And this is what the public were told. Now, most people were skeptical, but we don't have the information, so we don't know. But lo and behold, about a week ago, a prisoner was spotted by a worker in Shannon Airport, gesticulating from one of the planes. Now, he happened to be a military prisoner, in itself possibly significant. He was probably a deserter or somebody who's sick of what's going on. But it showed, if they were lying, the US government's excuse for this was it was an administrative error. We forgot to inform you that this prisoner was going through, even though it's completely illegal for such prisoners to be brought through Ireland. But the point is, it has blown the cover of the CIA and the Irish government, who were colluding in covering all this up and saying we should accept assurances from the people who gave us the lies about weapons of mass destruction. I mean, people were skeptical enough about that, but now we've caught them red-handed. And I think the point I'd make about that is that although it has not been half fast enough, the growing dissent in the US military itself, all the campaigning, all the protesting is beginning to impact and is beginning to dent them. And just this very last point is one little example of that is that the US have just passed $300 million for promoting US foreign policy in the Western media, including the appointment of new positions in US embassies called counselors for public diplomacy, who actually are willing to debate with us. We had a debate with them in Ireland a while ago. Richard. But the point I'm making is they are doing that because they know they're losing the argument on the ground. So we should take a little bit of heart from that, but we need to keep building the movement and building towards September the 23rd.
Just while Selena's reading her question, could, I think it's Almami Tal, be ready to speak? And I have a question from Jacob Berry that I'm going to read out, which says, how does Guantanamo Bay benefit the US government at all? Do you think that they use it to make the American people feel safe? Or is it possible that they genuinely think they're helping to stop terrorism? Answers on a postcard too. Okay, if you're ready. And then if Al-Mami can be ready to come and speak.
I think elements of what I was going to ask were just answered by the gentleman who spoke. But my question was, is what the Americans are doing in Guantanamo Bay actually any different than what the British did in Longkesh?
Is Al-Mami Tal here? Do you want me to read it out? Listen, my voice is not that good. You should come and speak, people. Okay, this is... I do believe that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. The war against injustice must be a global fight against impunity. In the UK, we have many prisons like Guantanamo, where traumatized and vulnerable asylum seekers who had committed no crime are locked up and awaiting deportation. Back to the country they had fled because of fear for their lives. The world is a global village, and remember, the things that are going around will come back around. John Shelton will be followed by Manfred Eku. And if Nick Richmond from the NUJ is in the room, can you indicate so I can call you? John? I'm going to get actors up here in a minute to do some of these. Okay, John has asked, we are constantly being reminded of the threat to stability that terrorism poses. I understand the concern for human rights of prisoners, but are there alternatives to dealing with individuals and groups that themselves fail to respect civilians' human rights? There's time for about 2 very quick contributions if anyone wants to try and answer those questions. Manfred Eku? Hooray. And Nick Richmond, are you here? Or did you go? Okay.
I just wanted to say that it isn't true that governments or European governments don't challenge Bush on the question of Guantanamo. In Vienna on the EU-US summit, it happened. He was asked when will he close it and so on, and he said, well, I want to close it, but I can't. That's more or less what he said and what was announced by all the papers. But the point I want to make is that even if he's being challenged by governments and by maybe other forces, I think the only reason when they will close down Guantanamo is when they really fear that they will immediately lose this war, and if they want to soften the pressure that they feel daily, maybe that's a reason when they will close down Guantanamo. And I think that Guantanamo is well at the heart of the anti-war movement everywhere. In Vienna, for example, you have seen several prisoners that walked around on the demonstration. I mean, people dressed as prisoners with orange suits. You have seen the Green Party who made a cage and walked on the demonstration and brought forward this issue. You have seen unorganized people with self-made placards who were dealing with the issue of Guantanamo. But the weakness is if it is not linked to all the other issues which will ultimately lead to a defeat of the US, meaning if it's not linked with the resistance in Iraq, which is the major point, or the major force which is stopping Bush, if it's not linked with all the discontent in the amongst the troops and the global movement. So the weakness of the Guantanamo actions in Vienna was that they said, well, we will, or the Green Party mostly said, we will use the issue of Guantanamo to protest against Bush and not touch the resistance of Iraq and not touch the issue of imperialism. And that's their weakness. Only if they link all the issues, I think they can, we can have a greater impact and bring the US administration closer to a defeat, and that's when they will close down Guantanamo.
Thank you. We haven't had any more slips come up, but there is time if people want to just, if anything's occurred to you in the last few minutes of the discussion, to ask quick questions and make quick contributions. So if we take you and then...
I'd just like to add something to what Victoria said. Let's not forget, before Guantanamo, there is 100 of people died in containers in Afghanistan, and nobody remembered those people. And a lot of them, they've been dumped on the Afghan desert, and nobody knows even their graves at the moment. So America, before Guantanamo, they committed mass murder in Afghanistan. Thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to say on the question about long cash, I mean, clearly Britain and the United States have a long history of colonial barbarity, and in a way making comparisons isn't really the point. But I think it is important to stress that what's going on at the moment is a kind of step change, at least over the last couple of decades, partly because what Guantanamo represents symbolically is something more than what's happening in Guantanamo, but it is actually an international network now involving extraordinary rendition, a whole number of CIA camps around the world, Abu Ghraib, and overall an attempt to normalise the idea that torture is okay, an attempt to criminalise the Muslim community right around the world, and an attempt to impose and to symbolise the growth of US power around the world. And I think it's all of those things. I just wanted to make a couple of points on those. The first is that while Guantanamo is an attempt to project US power around the world, I'm sure that's part of the thinking behind it. It's a kind of symbolic intimidation of the poor of the world, and particularly the Muslim community and the peoples of the Middle East. We must remember that it's quite hollow in a certain sense. That actually, if you look at the situation of US power at the moment, what you see is, in Afghanistan, they're pulling the troops out and desperately trying to get European troops and other NATO troops in. In Iraq, they are bogged down. They are facing military defeat, let alone losing the Battle of Hearts and Minds. They're facing military defeat in Iraq. And in general, the whole project of the kind of, the war on terror, the projection of US power is in deep trouble. Look at Latin America, for example. The area in which Guantanamo is cited is an area which is in virtual insurgency against Bush's project. So we must understand that underlying the symbolic power of the thing is actually a deep crisis for Bush. And the last thing is this. The last point I want to make is that, and other people have made it, but I think we should re-emphasize it, Guantanamo Bay, extraordinary rendition, the terminology they use, torture basically, these methods make people angry. It is generalising. They are generalising. I mean, we've seen in Britain, 250 police break into an innocent family and shoot someone in East Ham. It's generalising. The police are crawling all over the tubes in London. There's no question they're trying to use this atmosphere to repress civil liberties, but it makes people angry. And the question is, are we going to link the two things together, the question of civil liberties with the massive worldwide opposition to war? And crucially, are we going to fight back? And if we do fight back, we have the numbers, we have public opinion on our side, we have the ability to turn them round, because Bush and Blair are looking extremely weak at the moment. 2 weeks after 250 police stormed the Forest Gate house in Newham in East London, 1,000 local people marched through the streets of Forest Gate saying, stop the police attacks, stop the war in Iraq. If we do that everywhere, in the end we can persevere.
Thanks. I'm really sorry. I did see a couple of people just filling in slips at that last moment, but it is now time to ask Victoria to come back. So I really do apologise to those people. I've just got one announcement before Victoria speaks, which is a very important one for some of the young people here, which is that this year at Marxism, both Victoria's referred to it and I can see it with my own eyes, we have a fantastic number of young people attending Marxism, but we do have a very large shortage of accommodation for some of those young people to stay in. And the note from the Marxism team here says, especially beds and floor spaces in flats and houses. So you can imagine where those students are going to be staying unless we can dig up some extra accommodation for people. So if you have any space left at all to put up one of the young people that's staying at Marxism who doesn't yet have anywhere to stay, please do take the opportunity to take them. You'll have a fantastic few days of discussions and comradeship with them. You can go to the Marxism office, which is on the second floor in this building in room 2E, and let them know what space you have. They're open until 11 tonight. Okay, with no further ado, Victoria.
Well, thank you very much, everybody. I thought they were really interesting contributions, and I was particularly glad that a couple of you were much more upbeat than me. I like that optimism. I'm just going to try to answer some of the very specific questions. And forgive me if I don't manage to answer them all. These are the ones that I noted down. You asked about the ages of people in Guantanamo. Well, there were 4 teenagers, but of course they're no longer teenagers. And the youngest ones have been sent home to Afghanistan. But there's still one Canadian boy who was about 16 when he was first there, and I think he's 19 now. Apart from that, we don't really know, but I think the very elderly ones have also mostly been sent home to Afghanistan or to Pakistan. So there's a pretty wide gamut, I would say, between people in their 20s up to people in their 50s. I just want to make a reference to, somebody referred to the fact of the 3 suicides that were announced the other day. The ex-prisoners, both in Britain and in Kuwait, have very strongly suggested that those were not suicides, in fact. They've been presented as suicides, but people who know the individuals concerned and who also know the force that's been used to take people in and out of their cells at different times suggest that actually those were probably not suicides. So anybody who's writing or talking about this, I do urge you to read those things on cage prisoners before you describe them as suicides, unless you do it in inverted commas. Yes, the Libyan colleague referred to Omar Degayes, who is, of course, one of the 8 British residents that I urged you to get involved with the various campaigns around. Omar's campaign is based in Brittain, and it's extremely active. But the others who are in that group also need your thoughts and your activities. And somebody asked about the question of false confessions after torture. Any of you who've seen or would like to see the Michael Winterbottom film about Guantanamo, it completely encapsulates exactly how this kind of thing happens. The young men from Tipton were indeed tortured by being kept in solitary and in tiny little frozen containers, and were constantly interrogated and asked to admit that these photographs or these videos showed them in a group with bin Laden. And after some weeks of this treatment, they said, okay, yeah, it's me, sure, fine. And then they noticed that on the screen, there was a dating of when the photographs were taken. And the boy in question said, oh my God, I was working in Curry's in Birmingham that week. And that is actually how the Tiptons came to be got out, because actually the British intelligence services, when they were shown this video, which was supposed to prove that these 3 boys were there with bin Laden, when they checked it up, they found that one of them was indeed working in Curry's, and the others were helping the police with various inquiries into minor offences that they committed at that point. But I think the Winterbottom film shows very well exactly how you make a false confession. Jesus, let's be finished with this. It's just, you know, it's agony and it's pointless, so whatever you want me to say. And I think that's very, very common. And a lot of the people who've come out have talked about the false confessions that that they made, just to end it. And then somebody asked who should, in fact, put these prisoners or detainees on trial. I like to call them prisoners. Detainees is kind of like a sanitized word. These are prisoners. Who should put them on trial if somebody's going to put them on trial? Well, some have already been, those who've been returned to France and to Saudi have, in the French case, they have been put on trial. So not all of them, but some of them. But in all the cases where people have been returned, the legal authorities in that place, including Britain, have interrogated the guys again and looked at their record, and there isn't a single thing that they can be put on trial for. You've got to have done something to be put on trial, and the reason that no one's being put on trial is that the vast majority of them haven't done anything. And I think that is very, very clear in the statements, not only of the Red Cross, but even of many of the interrogators. They have actually told some of the prisoners, I'm supposed to go on interrogating you, but you know, I know you haven't done anything, so should we just chat? That is more common than you would realize. I think Chris answered the Long-Kesh parallel very, very clearly. And he's right when he says that Guantanamo, it's a good phrase, there's been a step change. But I think that one of the things that I would like you to take away from this that is different about this is that what has gone on around the Guantanamo, the whole of Guantanamo experience, has been the way the Bush administration has politicized the American judiciary in exactly the same way as well, more dramatically than what Blair is trying to do here. Both of them want the judiciary to see things their way. And if that becomes accepted, it will be a very, very important attack on democracy. If you cannot have a judiciary which is independent and which can criticize the executive and correct the executive, you're in very, very serious trouble. And this is one of the key things that Alberto Gonzales and John Yoo and all the other lawyers around the White House have tried to do, both with the appointments that have been made to the Supreme Court and in many federal courts, but also in the way that they are actually trying to revise what things mean in the American Constitution. And I think as you know, the same kind of thing is happening here when you have Blair saying things like, I can't understand why these judges, don't talk to us more. Why they don't see things our way. And again, when I talked earlier about we have some unlikely allies, some of the best allies that we've had in many of the Guantanamo cases here have been members of the House of Lords. And I'll just end by asking a question that several people asked in different ways about how does Guantanamo actually benefit the Americans? And Chris answered it by saying that it's a way of intimidation. And I remember very well a conversation I had with the father of one of the Kuwaiti detainees that I know. He's a Kuwaiti fighter pilot, very conservative, trained in America type person, knows America much better than I do, for instance. And I asked him exactly the same question. And he said, because the case of his son is one of these very, very clear ones in which the boy is completely and utterly innocent and was sold by a Pakistani policeman. And it's long been a puzzle to me as when this particular case, Fauzi, why he isn't released. And Fauzi's father said to me, what you have to understand about the Americans is they love demonstrating their power. They love flaunting the fact that they can hold Fauzi for no reason. And the fact that everybody in Kuwait knows that Fauzi is totally innocent is not an embarrassment to them, as you might think it would be. It's a way of demonstrating power. So I think that's Chris's answer, said in a slightly different way. So I'll just end by thanking everybody so much for your contributions. It was really interesting, and I wish we had more time to discuss. And have a wonderful few days.
Just as you're leaving, just to let you know that there are copies in bookmarks of Victoria's brilliant play. There's one up here you could buy and she'll sign, perhaps.
I'd first of all like to say I agreed with everything the first two speakers said, with the single exception of when the gentleman said that the Labour Party people lie without batting an eyelid. That's generally true, except in the case of Alistair Darling, who blinks furiously when he when he lies. You may all have seen last night. And I want to come down to the question of fundamental moral principle, because I also do not hold at all with this idea that we should be having a quiet, civilized debate. And whether you want your country to be independent or not is purely a lifestyle choice, like whether you have milk in your coffee. And when it's all over, we all have to be nice to each other and be terribly pleasant to the traitors in our midst. I don't hold with that at all. And I tell you why. I worked for the British Foreign Office. I became a British ambassador. I was a British diplomat for 20 years. I was always very patriotic to be British. I was very, very proud. I remember when I first became a British ambassador and first went out in my own flag car with the Union Jack flying on the front as the ambassador, you know, I had a lump in my throat. It was a proud moment for me. It was only 6 months after that I discovered that in the country where I was ambassador, we and the Americans were shipping people in order for them to be tortured. And some of them were tortured to death. Now, as you may imagine, my worldview changed. It was at the same time, about a month later, we invaded Iraq against the will of the Security Council. Not just without permission of the Security Council, but in the full knowledge that if it had gone to the Security Council, we would have been voted down. And I, as a British diplomat, saw all the internal memos that went through that decision. I know for certain, I used to be head of the FCO unit that monitored Iraqi weapons of mass destruction. And I know for certain, I can tell you, that they knew there weren't any. It wasn't a mistake, it was a lie. I think it is impossible to be proud of the United Kingdom. I think when we invaded Iraq, we did to the United Nations what Hitler and Mussolini did to the League of Nations. And I think what we've done since, where the truth is often much hidden, in the bombing, if you look at Libya, disaster now, we bombed it, we killed 15,000 people when NATO bombed Sirte, something they never told you on the BBC. And did we make it better? No. I saw in Uzbekistan, I saw the gas contract signed by Enron and a company called Unocal, which George Bush Sr. was on the board, to dig out gas pipelines from Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan over Afghanistan down to the Indian Ocean. And that was actually what the Afghan war was about. They'd actually had talks with the Taliban and Unocal to see if the Taliban would provide pipeline security. The person who held those talks was the consultant for Unocal, who's a certain Mr. Karzai, who after being employed by George Bush Sr. as a consultant, went on to become president of Afghanistan. That was their plan B. The Taliban wouldn't do it, so they invaded. It's usually, I've seen it on the inside, it's almost always about control of resources. It is every bit as corrupt as our first speaker, I'm sorry, I'm also terrible names, indicated. You were absolutely right, Andrew. And I can tell you it's not an academic construct. The system stinks. Westminster stinks. The British government is deeply, deeply immoral. They don't care how many people they kill abroad if it advances them. And anybody who votes no is voting to support a psychologically flawed, a pathological state, which is a danger in the world, a rogue state, a state prepared to go to war to make a few people wealthy. That's why I say it's not possible to be a decent person and vote no, and we shouldn't be ashamed to say that.